When this was playing out last year, I think we were wondering, like, what's going on? Why are we seeing these individuals being purged from the rocket force, for example? And now we have a pretty good idea.
Absolutely, and it's such a sort of notoriously opaque part of the Chinese establishment. So really some extraordinary reporting here from my colleagues in DC, essentially pointing to these deep flaws in the rocket force and in China's military preparedness, specifically when it comes to missiles. And US intelligence, these sources telling us that that is what's behind this really sweeping purge that we've seen. Just in terms of the known figures, at least 15 people from the defense establishment have been purged in recent months. Now, some of the extraordinary sort of insights that we got in this story include things like missiles being filled with water instead of fuel, as well as sort of hundreds of these missiles that are situated in Western China actually not having lids that essentially allow these missiles to even be fired at all. And so this does go, we think, some way to explain why we're seeing this really sort of radical revamp, which includes this unprecedented removal, at least in the modern era, of these two members of the Politburo late last year, Li Shangfu on the defense side and Foreign Minister Qin Gang.
Rebecca, given the extent of that corruption that you just detailed there, how does this put us in terms of Xi and China overall perhaps contemplating major military action in the coming years? Is this a setback in terms of that timeline, if at all?
Well, in the view of the US, certainly this does seem to be a setback, and that is part of how they're rationalizing why it is that Xi Jinping has come down so swiftly and so hard on these very, very senior figures that, presumably one would have thought would have been very closely vetted before being sort of, raised into the ascendancies. What's notable about this purge is that some of these figures that have now been removed were actually elevated by Xi or by very senior figures within the Chinese establishment themselves. China, for its part, continues to affirm that it is inevitable that it will reunify in its own language, for example, with Taiwan, which is, of course, a democratically run island that is about to see its own elections. But that issue of the flashpoint of Taiwan and China's sort of military preparedness for potential conflict with Taiwan is really front of mind here when we think about this story.
Yeah, and that's the question, right? Does it kind of change the picture going into Saturday's vote a little bit in terms of the pressure on these cross-strait relations? Because we do have at the same time, 5 US defense firms being sanctioned for these arms sales to Taipei.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, China certainly has long felt sort of quite vocal about pushing back against US support, or as it perceives US support of Taiwan. So the sanction of these 5 firms, it's largely likely to be symbolic in nature, would be my expectation, because these US defense firms don't really operate in China in a practical way. And so largely sort of symbolic, but certainly important sort of part of the narrative. And for many Taiwanese, of course, the threat of China and this reality of having long lived in the shadow of mainland China is what is informing their decisions as they go into the elections.